So good evening, everyone, and welcome back to this fourth panel of the day, which is titled somewhat interestingly, I wonder why, Will Energy Trump Climate? I'm Rathin Roy, I'm the moderator of this session, and the way this will go is as follows. I will open the session with a few opening remarks, pass on to my panelists, who will each speak for precisely 4 minutes, and we'll see what they have to say, and then take it from there. We will stop that interaction between the panelists at about 15 minutes past 7, and we'll have 15 minutes then for questions. So let's begin. Will energy trump climate? We have a choice. We can look at the word Trump as a proper noun, or we can look at the word Trump as a verb. Without influencing the choice of my fellow panelists, I'm going to use it as a verb. I guess because if you live in a developing country and an emerging economy like India, there is no automatic reason why you would not prefer to have a world which warms at less than 2 degrees any more than an American or a Brit. But if that comes with a postulation that it is a necessary condition for my country, India, for example, to be the first country in the history of the world to complete its development transformation without any substantive incremental recourse to fossil fuels, then I'm worried. The first country in the world, there'll be another 80 after me, but every other country, including China, has first completed its transformation using fossil fuels and then thought what to do to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels. That does not mean that it cannot be done. Of course it can. But the terms and conditions under which it can be done raise questions, and these questions are very often politically passionate. Irrespective of what kind of energy you use to finance your lifestyles, when I'm in a position where I need to get children in my country to have light bulbs to read with to complete their schooling, when I need energy to provide basic health care, is it appropriate that the rest of the world who spend the bulk of their energy on lifestyle consumption, where I can sit in Norway in my shirt sleeves and then lecture Indians about not using fossil fuels, is that an appropriate political economy environment to be in? So for all these reasons, for me, it is important to ask that when we move towards a common goal of reducing the impact of global warming so as to minimize the damage caused by climate change, what does that mean for what you're telling me and 80 developing countries after me in terms of how and what I use to generate the hugely incremental amounts of energy that I intend to. In addition, there remains the fact that India and many other developing countries have made an incredible commitment, our Prime Minister not least an international commitment through the International Solar Alliance, to increase and accelerate the amount of energy being produced through renewables to an extent unknown in the world historically. 100 gigs by 2022 is no small ask and a difficult task, but then that is not going to be enough to come up to even remotely comparable levels of per capita consumption of electricity with other countries in the world. There are questions regarding financing. There are also questions regarding national security. I happen to have coal in my country. I also have the sun, but I have to convert the sun into something else. So all these questions make it difficult for me to view the question as, will energy, using Trump as a verb, trump the aspirations that we have to reduce global warming? So that's the context where I'm sitting. I'm sure my panelists will have different, or perhaps complementary, or perhaps completely adversarial points to make. So but at any rate, I think this will be a challengingly robust debate. So let me not stand between you and the panelists, and let me begin by asking Lydia Powell, who is Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, to kick off the panel. Lydia, over to you.
Thank you very much. I don't disagree with what Rathin said. I'll just elaborate them with some stylized facts. I personally think that with the different person in the White House, the conversation on climate change will change from being a religion to being more reasonable. And the fierce attack on fossil fuels, I think, does many things. One, Rathin already alluded to, that we forget the fact that we are internal to the problem. Second, we forget the difference fossil fuels has made to the livelihoods and quality of life. And third, we kick the ladder from the poor, which Rathin explained. And just to give you some facts, from 15,000 to 1750, the amount of wealth generated, it's 250 years, was about 21 trillion. And in the just 50 years from 1950 to 2000, the amount of wealth generated was about 847 trillion. And this wealth has created, is the result of surplus energy that fossil fuels generated. And if you had to replace this energy with a human being, for example, you will need about 66 billion people peddling 8 hours a day to replace the energy, just the oil we use. And I think that the surplus that we have generated has contributed to social progress, economic progress, technological progress. And I feel that even the movement against fossil fuels is fueled by fossil fuels. I don't think I need to say more. We will talk when we have the conversation.
Thank you, Lydia. Short and sweet, and that leaves us even more time for a debate. Let me now also turn to my friend from Kazakhstan, Mr. Erlan Batyrbekov, who is Director General of the National Nuclear Center of the Ministry of Energy in Kazakhstan, who is going to speak about how Kazakhstan is responding in this context to the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Until recently, danger of fossil fuel depletion such as coal, oil, and gas triggered globally search for alternative energy sources. This is obviously still the problem now. But today the global climate change, the global warming, waste problems, and access to the resource along the with conservation of biodiversity and energy communication safety are coming to the forefront of national concerns. Most of the problems we faced can be solved or reduced by transition from the fossil fuel to the renewable and more environmental friendly power supply method as the solar, wind, hydropower, and geothermal energy. Here we can also relate to the nuclear power now and the fusion power in the future. I fully believe that the Paris Agreement showed strong commitment of the global community to the stop environmental degradation. Our country has made important contribution to addressing environmental problems and at the regional and national levels. Kazakhstan ratified the Paris Agreement in October last year. Kazakhstan also affirmed its commitment to the global policy on the transition to the low carbon development and decarbonized world economy. And Kazakhstan declared its obligation of reducing by 50% of the greenhouse gas emission by 2030. But in the case of financial support, we can also reach the number 25%. President of our country, Nursultan Abishevich Nazarbayev, suggested mapping out the global roadmap on a green economy development on the basis of Paris Agreement at the Astana Economic Forum, which has been held in May 2016. Kazakhstan adopted green economy concept policy in 2013 that laid the foundation for substantive economy transformation. We have 3 milestones of Kazakhstan concept, and we also understood that the Republic of Kazakhstan meeting the new low carbon model will face new challenges. For example, significant reduction of coal-fired power generation will cause serious problem in coal mining. Today, more than 80% of electricity is generated using hydrocarbon. Coal is about 30%, and the rest is the gas and petroleum products. We see the potential in development of new processes of the industry, for example, like the cold chemistry. Also, Kazakhstan is planning to develop nuclear power along with other low-carbon generation sources. The forthcoming realization around the 2030 and the following development of nuclear power generation is the most expected important change in the balance of electric power generation. Also, the fusion energy is expected to be in the future. This would allow to address the concern in limited capacity of energy sources. That is why Kazakhstan, on the base of the National Nuclear Center of the Republic of Kazakhstan, the construction of the world's first technology tokamak to conduct research investigation and testing for the future fusion reactors is reaching completion. This project will be the contribution of Kazakhstan in the promotion of the fusion power in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a country that is highly coal dependent, doing interesting things, including experimenting with restarting nuclear power, which is a great place to bring in my friend Mike Shellenberger, who is the founder and president of Environmental Progress Limited.
Can everybody hear me? Is that okay? Am I loud enough? Well, thank you for inviting me to speak. It was nice to be back at the Raisina Dialogue. I wanted to offer some context for thinking about climate change. Climate change and global warming, these are environmental problems, and I want to argue that there's a pattern to how humans solve environmental problems, and the way we solve them always creates new ones. But it really goes along with the pattern of human development. I mean, really everywhere in the world, except for in some oil-rich countries, development occurs in the same way. You have small farmers, they become more productive, you get manufacturing that pulls those small farmers to the cities. They move away from wood and dung to hydroelectricity, to coal and fossil fuels. And then there's questions about what comes after fossil fuels. Do we move to uranium with nuclear fission? Do we move to solar and batteries? So there's some questions on that. But I think it's important to context how environmental progress occurs, which is in this pattern of moving towards using more energy, not less, moving towards using energy sources that are more reliable, that are cheaper, that are cleaner, and they're more energy dense. And so I think when we're thinking about climate, that context got lost when we started just dealing with climate change and global warming strictly as a pollution problem and forgetting to put it in that larger developmental context. And so what we end up with is a Paris Agreement that is an agreement, it's not a treaty, it's not binding. It requires things of countries, but the things that the countries have all agreed to do are well within the business as usual baselines of what you would expect to happen already. But I think there's some good news too. What we see happen in rich countries, in the United States, in Europe, our pollution, our conventional pollutants all peaked and have been declining since the late 60s and early 70s, with the exception of carbon dioxide, which has peaked and has started to decline about 10 years ago. And so I think one question then is what can be done to accelerate that peaking of carbon dioxide in China and India and developing countries? And I think the answer is that it needs to happen in that process of environmental progress and development. And that means that it's not a process of actually reducing growth or making energy more expensive. In fact, what we find is that when countries move, for example, from coal to natural gas, this is true everywhere, by the way, we do so because the natural gas becomes much cheaper. So we have a fracking revolution in the United States, but before that in Europe, large deposits of oil and natural gas were found, and in England and the rest of Europe started moving from coal to natural gas. I think we got ourselves into a really confused place when we imagined that we were going to solve climate change by making energy significantly more expensive. People are willing to pay a little bit more money for less air pollution, but not significantly more. I mean, almost nowhere do you find people willing to spend a lot more money on reducing air pollution. But they are willing to move towards cleaner sources of energy when they become much cheaper. So I think a big focus on innovation needs to be a part of this, and that was the most significant thing to come out of Paris, by the way, was Bill Gates and Obama and Modi and other leaders said we've got to put technological innovation as a priority. I think the other thing that is important is that everyone sort of forgot about nuclear. You know, nuclear is the largest source of zero carbon power in the United States. India has a nuclear program, a number of nuclear power plants, but it sort of got stalled out in part because of public fears, even though it is the safest way to make reliable power. It's a reliable source of power. So I think one of the shifts that we're starting to see to avoid energy trumping climate, and Trump, as long as we're using that word, is actually very pro-nuclear, as was Obama, is a new emphasis on nuclear. And you see that here in India, a number of deals have gone through. But I think that's going to be a really important focal point going forward, because that is a way to provide cheap and reliable power for development while also producing electricity that doesn't create pollution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. That was very interesting. Just to context the debate before I turn to Sumant. So essentially, the word environmental progress means that you have progress, and that entails environmental transformations. And you need more energy, you need it cheaper, and you need, therefore, to walk that path. And in walking that path, perhaps one promising area, which we may be ignoring at our peril, is nuclear energy. So, well put. And now it's my pleasure to invite Sumant Sinha, who is Chairman and CEO of Renew Power Ventures Private Limited India, which is all about clean, renewable energy. Over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Rathin. So I'll make 2 points in the 4 minutes that I have. One is about climate change in general, and you guys can hear me? This is fine? And the second issue is what can be done about it, and will therefore, in fact, energy trump climate? And I'll give you a quick pointer, my point of view on that. So the first thing is that, unfortunately, as we all have been reading in the press consistently, the reality of the situation is that the world as a whole is not going to stay within 2 degrees centigrade temperature change, because, we had the Paris Agreement, and flawed as it is taking us to a 3.5 degrees centigrade trajectory at this point in time. And we need to do a lot more in terms of multilateral action and individual country action to basically stay within this 2 degrees centigrade number. And at this point in time, certainly it doesn't look like we're going to hit that number, largely also because the US certainly at this point does look like it's going to withdraw itself, or certainly become neutral to or intransigent about the Paris Agreement. And, to me, it's actually quite unbelievable that, literally 1% of the world's population, which is the 65 odd million people who voted for Trump, actually are threatening to put at risk an agreement that impacts the livelihood of 7 billion people. And that's really something that I think the rest of the world has to think about. But India, unfortunately, is one of the countries that is most vulnerable to climate change issues. And therefore, it is really incumbent upon us to think about what we can do to address this problem. Apart from whatever leadership we can take on a multilateral basis, what can we do domestically to actually try to mitigate this problem of our growth continue to add to the climate change issues? And I think this is really where there's some good news. And the good news really is that the conversation does not have to be framed in the context of it's an either-or situation. It's not as if, coal is the only solution, and if we do renewables, it's going to be much more expensive, and so therefore, do we want climate change or do we want cheaper power? I think that particular question actually has now become an outdated question. And the reason I say that is because of technology improvements, the cost of renewables has now come down to such an extent that if you look at the total capacity add in the last year in the globe as a whole, more than 50 to 60% was actually out of renewable energy sources. And so what is happening is the world as a whole is migrating from new capacity add from conventional into renewables. And even for India, if you look at the current government's plan with the 175 gigawatts of renewables to be set up, that is going to actually account for the bulk of new capacity that is going to be set up in India as well. And so therefore, the world is actually moving more and more rapidly towards renewables. And the reason for that is not necessarily climate change only. It is the fact that it's becoming the cheapest source of power. And if you look at the costs in India, the cost of setting up a solar power 1 megawatt unit, or the cost per kilowatt hour of solar, has now become cheaper than that of new thermal. And so therefore, the natural economics would dictate that you should add more and more capacity in renewables. Now, of course, there are issues about renewables, which is around grid integration and so on. And so that's where, if you have further technology developments happening on the battery side, certainly a lot of that intermittency can be addressed through that particular mechanism. And if you can do that, then you actually have a solution which can actually address your climate change issues, but it's also the cheapest solution. It's also disaggregated, can be off-grid as well. So it provides a huge amount of flexibility to the energy markets to go down the path of renewables. And just a word about nuclear, our view certainly is that nuclear is much more expensive than renewables are right now. And so to us, the natural path forward really would be in the dimension of renewable energy. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So that was loud and clear. Renewables make good business sense. We have coal, and it is inevitable that if renewables continue to make good business sense, then we will shift. So we don't really have to worry about climate change as an imperative, and we don't have to worry about subsidies for renewables. We'll come back to that. Finally, but not the least, certainly, I'd like to invite Sonny Kapoor to conclude this first round. He's Managing Director of Redefine UK.
Thank you. I think rather uniquely on the panel, I have a slightly more holistic perspective. My training was as an engineer, and then I was an investment banker for a while. Then I was a development economist, then started advising sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, and now work on public policy and climate change. So let me try and address all of these perspectives. The quick answer, I think, to the question, which is, will energy trump climate, is in the short term, that's already the case. It has been. Climate change is real. Global warming is happening. We can all see the manifestations. But in the medium term, I think there isn't a trade-off. And that is why I'm really hopeful. So let me explain why. The first is technology. Technological progress on renewables, particularly solar, is happening much faster than any of us had predicted. It's sort of almost catching up with Moore's law, which is what applies to the progress of computing power. To give perspective, it is improving so fast that if this were to continue, and if this was applied, for example, to a Volkswagen Beetle car from the 1970s, that car would now be traveling at the speed of light. It would be giving you 2 million miles to the gallon, and it would cost you 4 cents, right? So this is the rate of progress in solar technology today, and this is even before we have had any major path-breaking shifts. For example, those that include quantum phenomenon, which is very likely. The financial stakes are so big, whoever gets it right gets to bear such large rewards that inevitably the speed of progress is going to be much faster than we would have expected. Now, let me also use this to address a point that was made about nuclear. Now, nuclear is a mature technology where so far, in the past 35 years, not one OECD country has managed to actually make a nuclear plant that is within budget. The liabilities are carried on the public balance sheet, and the dangers, which we all saw with Fukushima and Chernobyl, are very real. Nuclear is not the future, renewables are. So technology was one. The second is macroeconomics. If you just look at the energy security dimension, so India's largest contribution to the deficit is from fossil fuel imports, as it is for most of Southern Europe, as it is for the largest number of countries in the world. And for these countries, the uncertainty of imports, the price of imports, means there's energy insecurity and significant macroeconomic risk if you continue your dependence on your fossil fuels. So even if the costs of renewables were actually higher, both from a security and a macroeconomic dimension, it actually does make sense to migrate to renewables. And nowhere more so than a country such as India, where many of the production facilities for wind and solar can actually be domestic. You don't actually have to depend on an unreliable, expensive source of import. So that's the macroeconomic reason. The microeconomic reason was already highlighted. We've come to the point where the cost of solar and the cost of wind on many, many criteria in many countries has now actually fallen, even without taking into account the negative health costs, the potential policy changes of future carbon prices into account. It has already exceeded what thermal and what fossil fuels can deliver. So we are in a domain where it makes individual business sense, where it makes macroeconomic sense, where it makes technological sense. And last but not the least, this is at a time where there's $80 trillion worth of long-term capital earning yields of between 2 to 3%, mostly invested in the OECD economies, desperately looking to diversify, desperately looking to generate returns. And there is no place better at this point in history than to be putting these tens of billions, hundreds of billions, even trillions of investments in emerging and developing economies which have favorable demographics, technological catch-up potential, much faster growth rates that give risk diversification for these funds and generate returns that are greater than zero. About $400 billion dollars worth of sovereign bonds and corporate bonds in the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund now yield 1%. More than 100 billion yield less than 0%. This money can be so much better deployed in a place like India, in solar plants, and believe you me, it will be.
Thank you, Sony. I'll respond to you in a minute, but for the rest, I have questions. So let me first ask Lydia. What I hear Sumant saying is that without taxing fossil fuels and without subsidizing renewable energy, the production function for renewable energy in the long run will be cheaper. So we don't need government intervention. It's just markets that will make it cheaper. Would you agree?
If that were true, then I would just like to ask the two speakers if they are using it at home, number one, and number two, and if not, why? And number two, why decentralized renewable energy projects in India are, when I counted last, was less than 3%. The solar projects was less than 3% of total installations, whereas the grid connected accounted for about 97%, which means they need the subsidy from the grid. If what they are saying is true, the whole of rural India should be lit up with renewable energy, buzzing with economic activity. Their own homes should be lit up by renewable energy. So I would...
Well, if I can respond to that, your contention is that thermal power is cheaper, right? And so therefore that should also be lighting up every single home in India. But the fact is it's not, simply because the grid is not there in a number of places in the country. So I don't think the fact that renewables is not lighting up homes right now is the argument to make, to say that it is not competitive. The fact is it's a new technology. It takes time to roll out technologies, and eventually over time it will become much more prevalent than it is right now. But it's new, right? Now if you look at where costs are today, and if you look at what is happening on the rooftop space right now, a lot of institutional and commercial customers are now beginning to shift, and to the extent that they have rooftop space, they are installing rooftop facilities. Because rooftop solar now is already cheaper than grid-connected power. And so there is, I don't know whether you're aware of the numbers or not, but almost 1,000 megawatts of rooftop solar has already been installed in the country, out of the 9,000 that is currently installed. This year, this calendar year, we're going to be installing another 9,000 megawatts or 10,000 megawatts of solar in India, which is going to be much more than the new thermal installations. And these are now going to be done at rates of 4 rupees per kilowatt hour. Now, if you cost where new thermal is going to be set up today, it's probably going to be higher than that. And keep in mind that these costs for solar are going to be fixed for the next 25 years. There's going to be no cost escalation. There's going to be no cost changes, right? The costs are totally locked and loaded for the next 25 years, whereas in thermal, costs could keep going up or down depending on the price of coal. So just because it's not there today is not a good enough reason to say that it's not going to be there tomorrow. It is cheaper, and it is going to get more and more prevalent as we go forward.
Okay. A quick question for both of you. A quick question for both of you. Sure. At the same time, you're saying that technological progress in this area is very fast. I'm a finance guy, I don't understand. But what I do know is if technology changes and you've got to go on junking old technology to replace it with new technology, then the definite, the sort of overall cost of moving to this paradise of extremely powerful batteries is very high. And is that not therefore going to be an impediment, one? And two, who owns these? Are we capable of making these technologically more sophisticated solar panels in India, or are we going to be dependent for these panels? Because if we are going to be dependent on China and other countries for these panels, in geoeconomic terms, perhaps we should be staying with our own coal. So first Sumant and then Sonny.
No, so I think to answer your question, when a solar plant is set up with a certain technology, with a certain kind of solar panels, the cost is fixed, and then that plant stays and operates for the next 25 years. It's not like you replace those solar panels with more efficient solar panels a year or 2 years or 3 years later, right? So every time you set up a plant, you lock in the price, and that price stays. Now, in terms of what is happening on the technology front, and therefore do you get dependent on some other country, the answer today is yes. China accounts for 75 to 80% of the world's solar panel manufacturing. Right? So the rest of the world is dependent upon China, not just India. And unfortunately, it's getting harder and harder to compete with the Chinese because they've got a massive industry now. They've got economies of scale that is very hard to compete with. And the Indian government has been trying to come out with a policy to incentivize manufacturing, but it's every time they try to sort of target a certain cost for the panels, panel costs come down even further. And so therefore, that's becoming harder for them to do. And so therefore, yes, you will have to buy all these panels from outside of India. What you can do is you can encourage these guys to manufacture in India through Make in India and all of these sorts of schemes. Now, that may mean the cost goes up a little bit, but I think that's perhaps in the longer run, from a country standpoint, a price worth paying.
Sorry.
1.6 million people in China died prematurely last year because of pollution related to coal. Many of you live in Delhi. You've seen the situation here. The fact is very, very clear. It's not just about carbon price. So many of the externalities of coal, including the effect on water, etc., are not taken into account. It's not really a choice. It's not really a competition. The overall lifetime costs of existing solar technology are significantly lower than thermal. If you look at global numbers, the amount of subsidies offered to fossil fuels is a significant multiple of any subsidies offered to renewables, and that includes the whole global picture. Some of that is slowly starting to change, and in all the discussions on subsidies, we often tend to forget that, right? So there's the externalities, the direct environmental costs, and this is not even carbon dioxide, this is particulate matter, etc. And Indian coal is especially poor quality. The health externalities, all the other externalities that come, you add that, you add the future expected policy action where we know whatever happens 5-10 years from now, carbon price will be put in place somewhere, if not in India, externally, and it will be higher than what it is now. And you are not going to be making a good investment if you put in place a plant that's going to operate for the next 20, 30 years, which doesn't take that into account. The economics is very, very clear. The health and policy benefits are very clear. The macroeconomic benefits are clear. On this last issue of manufacturing, that's a failure of industrial policy of India. That's not a failure of energy policy. That's not a fault of technology. And actually, if we know, based on WTO cases and complaints by German manufacturers, we should enjoy the fact that the Chinese government is subsidizing the export and the manufacture of solar panels. And when they stop, we can import the technology, we can get them to manufacture domestically, and we have more than enough time, given that the manufacture and the scale and most future installation is going to be in India rather than China the next 20 years or so. We have more than enough time to develop a domestic, healthy, competitive industry.
Sorry, I must sort of take issue with the macro before passing on to Mike. We do not remember, we do not import coal in any great measure in India. So the coal is here. And if we can clean it up and use it more productively, it would be nice, but it is here. Where fossil fuels are concerned, and there are many people, there's a former JS hydrocarbons here, Mr. Joshi, who knows more about this than I do. But this oil price shock hurt us too, because what we do? We buy crude and we refine it and we sell it. So if you look at our net import dependence on fossil fuels, it's actually not as high as you're saying. Then you add to the fact that I have to import from China in the foreseeable future. Sorry, the macroeconomic impact is not as unambiguous as you're saying at all. But, it's very clear from this that the business case for solar exists. But I'm curious about why we cannot say at the same time the business case for nuclear does not exist. So Mike, what's your view on this? I know that you don't like coal, but what's your view on why the business case for nuclear does not exist for a country like India?
So, you guys are investors in solar, right?
No. I don't have a financial stake, if that's what
you don't have a financial stake, okay. And I'm a think tank guy, historian. It's interesting that people would say something like solar is a relatively new technology. So the first solar panels were demonstrated in 1896 in New York City. Solar in the United States has been subsidized in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. We did a report. I personally lobbied the Obama political team in 2007 to make a very big investment in solar. We did about $150 billion in solar and wind and efficiency in the United States between 2009 and 2014. The last year that the US government looked at the subsidies, solar got 140 times more in subsidies than nuclear, and wind got 17 times more.
You say 140?
140 times, and don't take my word for it, it's just Google, you can Google Energy Information Administration. Wind power is, 600 years old? They're cool technologies, they've just got this one problem, which is that they only produce power 10 to 20% of the time. So that means that solar and wind can't power this room right now, and it doesn't. In California, we've done about 10% of our power is now from solar. This last spring, we had to cut the power off from all of the solar farms because it was going to overwhelm the grid. Are there batteries? There's only one way to store large amounts of electricity, and it's through something called pumped hydro. You got to pump the water uphill, and then when it's dark or not windy, then you run it back over the turbines. That's incredibly limited. So India is already dealing with this problem. China is curtailing its wind. India is doing 5 gigawatts of solar a year, by the way. It's not going to hit that 100 gigawatt target. So it's a funny thing. I was sort of listening, kind of going, I thought we cared about climate change, but then it's like you want to take nuclear off the table. Nuclear is 20% of our electricity in the United States. Solar is 0.8, under 1%. And that's after 100 years of subsidies and 150 billion. Look, if there's a moment when the combination of solar panels and batteries are cheaper than nuclear, awesome. Let's do that. But why would we be shutting down nuclear plants now if we care about climate change and air pollution? There's only 2 countries in the world that have scaled up low-carbon, pollution-free power at a pace to deal with climate change, and it's Sweden and France. France gets 75% of its power from nuclear. There is no country that gets anything remotely close to that from solar and wind, nor could they. So look, I love solar and wind. We have solar in my house, actually. Like I said, I lobbied for the subsidies. We should have those. But there are hard physical constraints here. Here's a very interesting statistic that we just figured out. It was in the New York Times today. If you read the economics columnist in the New York Times, Eduardo Porter, he wrote a great column about this today. Germany last year installed 11% more wind capacity, 11% more wind turbines. But they only got 1% more of their electricity from wind. Does anybody know why that is? Can anybody guess? It just wasn't very windy in Germany. So you could have installed 3 times that and you would not have gotten enough power. They installed 2.5% more solar panels in Germany. The amount of power they got from solar went down 1%. I bet you can guess why that was. So it was a cloudy and windless year in Germany. So that's your problem with it. So look, in some of these rural villages in India, it's wonderful to have solar panels. Although I would just note that India's own rural electrification program is to hook rural villages up to the electrical grid. And there's this very famous story where Greenpeace electrified this village with a microgrid with the villagers, and they even had batteries, I believe. And the villagers, when the energy minister, I believe, came, I don't know if it was Goyle or somebody else comes, they had a protest. They said, we want real electricity. Why? Civilization rests on 24/7 power. If you've ever taken your child to an emergency room in the middle of the night, you want cheap, reliable power. So like I said, one day when we'll get there, hopefully solar panels, but why would we be taking nuclear off the table? That would suggest that this isn't about climate, that it's about something else.
May I, Rathin?
Let me give Sumant a chance first, and then...
Yeah, thank you. No, look, I think, Mike, the issue is, we are used to getting attacked by the coal guys, but not by the nuclear guys. So I think, I think nuclear is a fellow traveler on the clean energy bandwagon, right? So I don't think that anybody has any fundamental issues with nuclear being bad, okay? Just like we have, for example, we may have that issue with coal, but not with nuclear. The only issue is that in our case, I think in India, there are fuel supply issues around nuclear, and there are cost issues around nuclear. And perhaps that is why we don't have as much nuclear as we could have had otherwise. The second thing is that there must be a reason as a result of which 140,000 megawatts worth of wind and solar was set up by the world last year, notwithstanding all the issues that you mentioned right now. So there has to be a reason behind that, and the reason is economic, and it is also the fact that people can look into the future, and when they look into the future, they see the cost of renewables coming down even further. And so the more you install today, the more it's going to get cheaper in the future. And so therefore, there is an imperative that policymakers have realized that you have to do more and more renewables right now, and that is going to make it much more competitive going forward as well.
Just a quick point on that.
Okay. All of you for 1 minute at the end.
Okay.
I think it's time to throw it open to the audience. So I'm going to take questions, but these are going to be points that you're going to make in 20 seconds. I'm going to cut you off. So please go ahead. And I will cut you off.
It's a very important point which has not been discussed. 20 seconds, it'll take more than that. And I have to preface it. As James Goldsmith, the UK billionaire, he founded the European late dying in his villa by the seaside in Mexico. He sent me his book, The Trap, which dealt with the nuclear power. The legacy costs of nuclear power are going to be horrendous for the coming generations. If today a nuclear plant to build and construct and get into service is $5 billion, the legacy cost after 50 years when you want to entomb it or decommission it is going to be anything between 50 and $100 billion. Who is going to pay that cost?
Thank you. Yes. Yes, go ahead, go ahead. Do you want to speak?
Yes.
Please go ahead. I'll come to you next. Go ahead.
Mike Clark, Arrow Advisory. The Paris Agreement gave rise to the FSB Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. What contribution do members of the panel think that those recommendations, which were published in December, will help us achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement? Thank you.
Thank you. Only those who have read the task force report need reply. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sanket Kulkarni from ORF Mumbai. My question is to any one of the distinguished panelists. Rare earth is one of the most important feedstock for the manufacturing of solar power panel cells. And we all know that if you look at the global supply chain of rare earth, China enjoys a complete monopoly over the rare earth industry. So given this fact, like fossil fuels, even renewable industry is not immune from geopolitics. Considering that, and the conference talks about multilateralism, what kind of multilateral framework can we evolve to, in a way, strengthen and make the renewable energy sector more immune from global geopolitical risks?
I'm going to ask you to pause for a second because we have almost a panel here, and I haven't seen a single woman ask a question. Is there any woman who desires to ask a question? I hereby give you priority. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Lindsay Iverson. I work at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. The question that I have is something that none of you seem to have touched on very much, which is public policy. I mean, part of the reason that conventional pollutants went down at the end of the 60s or early 70s is that the Clean Air Act was passed, and legislation forced people to change the way that they produced things. They produced energy and ran cars and things like that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see for the role of government in essentially forcing changes in how energy is produced. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question.
My question is regarding a liability issue. Indo-US nuclear deal is pending for last so many years. Whether operator will be responsible or not?
Oh, what a lovely question. I wish all these questions were like this. Great. So now I'm going to start with Sony and end with you in sequence. Please take about, if you can take about a minute to 90 seconds. You, sir, have 2 minutes.
Sure. Okay. According to the Paris Agreement, of course, it's very important, and it's very important now and shows strong commitment of global community to stop environmental degradation. And as already told, the Kazakhstan declared the obligation of reducing by 50% of greenhouse gas by 2030, and also can be to up to 25%. About the power plant, we are talking about the last Fukushima accident, as I understood, because of it was last accident in power plant. But we have to know that this was power plant of first generation. It was even not the third generation of power plant. Today, under construction, the generation number 4, number 4 plus. It means that this nuclear power plant doesn't depend on the behavior or mind of the person. It's make a decision itself. So, and it's very, very low the possibility of accident like we had in Fukushima, for example, or Chernobyl, for example, or United States in islands.
Thank you. Thank you. Sony?
Well, the market has made its judgment and nuclear has fallen short. There's not a single country in which nuclear can operate without implicit or in most cases now explicit government subsidy. Toshiba's share price has fallen by about 40%, partly because of the liabilities of Westinghouse, which is its nuclear subsidiary. The total cost of disasters, Chernobyl plus Fukushima, etc., depending on what time frame you look at, is more than $500 billion already and counting. In the United Kingdom, which is trying to build a Hinkley Power Point nuclear plant, the nuclear company was promised a power price that was twice what the market was delivering at that time for the next 25 years. And in 4 years alone, the government had to change its estimate, because in the original estimate, they had projected that even in 2025, nuclear would be cheaper than solar. And in 4 short years, they had to completely revise their calculation because the progress in the speed of solar technology development was so quick that the economic case for Westinghouse has collapsed. Nuclear has been damned by the market, not because of an ideology. On the issue of fossil fuels and subsidy, the fact of the matter is once you take into account the cost of uncertainty, because if you build a gas plant, if you build a gas turbine, you do not know what the price of gas is going to be for the next 25 years. And as an economist, you attach a risk premium to that. And that risk premium is less than what you would attach to the change in sunshine or wind power in Germany, which from a year to year can change by 10–20%, but this is far less than what we have historically seen, oil price variation. So nuclear has failed, the macroeconomic costs of fossil fuels, not to even mention climate change, are huge, particularly for non-fossil fuel producing countries. Thermal, particularly coal power, has become uneconomic, even if you take a small percentage of the health costs imposed on society because of that. The only case, the only macroeconomically and technologically sensible case is for renewables, and there is more than enough money to finance it. All we need is public policy, if not now, then even 5-10 years from now. And you have to remember, given the time frames of investment, even the possibility of a higher climate change tax or the equivalent of a Clean Air Act in India is more than enough to deter future investments, which will only pay off in 20-25 years. And as an investor, if you invest without taking that policy change expectation into account, you deserve to go bankrupt.
Well, if you can give me the money in India without adding 250 basis points because of my regulatory risk and because you think I'm a badly governed country, be my guest. We'll all go solar tomorrow. Lydia and then Sumant.
See, I'm still not convinced that renewable energy is cheaper. The cost that we are looking at is the levelized cost of electricity, and since the fuel is literally free, it has to be cheaper if you're only looking at levelized cost. If you look at total cost, it's still unaffordable. For every report that you have quoted, I can quote a counter report. One of it is the recent report from the MIT, which says that even at a carbon price of, let's say, $30 per ton, renewable energy is not competitive. And some have actually said that even if you give away solar panels free, it is not competitive, especially when you want the same quality of life, same level of economic activity. The question of subsidies too, subsidies per energy delivered is much lower for fossil fuels. But let's not bore the audience with the numbers. I think it is wrong to give the impression that renewable energy is a dollar lying on the street. If it was, even those who are speaking in favor of it would have picked it up by now, and the fact that they haven't shows that there are problems.
Sumant.
No, so I think dollar lying on the street, if I were just to give our example, our company's example, we've actually raised close to $3 billion in the last 5 to 6 years and actually invested that into renewable energy assets in India. So the reality is that there is commercial action taking place, and there is a good reason for it, which is that it is becoming more competitive now. But having said that, I think that this is not an either-or situation. In the case of India, I think everybody recognizes that coal, takes up about 50-60% of India's total power demand and generation, and it will probably carry on doing that such a large number in the future as well. And I think, therefore, we have to be prepared for the fact that as a country, India is going to continue to be an emitter of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And the fact that we have done a very small per capita amount so far, in some ways, and you at ORF and all have argued that there is a case to be made for India's exceptionalism or having an India exception in the case of climate change issues and so on. So I think the reality is you're going to have coal for the next few years. Renewables is going to become an increasing part, and perhaps 5 to 7 years later, when battery storage becomes cheaper, renewables will then become the predominant new source of energy going forward. Maybe over a longer period of time, maybe coal dials down, maybe it doesn't. It really depends on what's happening in climate change issues at that point in time. Thank you.
Should that be, as a person who instinctively thinks that what's in the ground is better than what's coming in the future, if the scenario is laying out is true, I have no problem with that in a public policy sense. That is good. At least we have agreement there, coming from the coal side. Mike, you had lots of questions directly stated to you. You have the last word before we close.
Well, and I'll try to address the young woman who asked a question about public policy. I mean, I think most of us on this panel think that you got to have a pretty open view to these things, that you don't just say no to some technology. I mean, we can't solve global warming on the backs of the poorest people in the world. I mean, no one should be denying poor countries coal or fossil fuels for any reason. That would just be absolutely unethical. Nor do I think it is ethical to shut down our largest source of clean power. I mean, the kind of this double standard, that it's okay to subsidize solar and we should keep subsidizing solar, but we can't subsidize nuclear. I mean, why don't we just equalize the subsidies? How about just an equal amount of subsidy instead of 140 times more for solar and 17 times more for wind? I mean, there's 30 states of the 50 United States that have mandates that require solar and wind to be done that exclude nuclear from that mandate. Why don't we include that in there? I mean, let's be reasonable. When the day comes when we have our super cheap batteries that can power this huge building and civilization when the sun's not shining, that's awesome. You know, let's work towards it. What's that? Oh, yeah. So it's, again, the double standard. So what happened? Nuclear is the only form of making power that internalizes its own waste. Tiny quantity of waste. All of the waste from a single power plant can fit on this stage from here to the ceiling. Okay, it's the only one that does that. What do you think we do with our solar panels when they run out? Do you think we put them on the compost and they disintegrate? I mean, there's toxic rare earth chemicals in all of those solar panels. There is no plan to dispose safely of any of them, nor with the batteries. So let's just have some reasonable, fair standards here. If we're going to require, as we should, a full life cycle assessment of these things, let's require it of all of the different technologies. I don't think that in a world of 7 going on 9 billion people, where 1 billion lack any access to electricity, 3 billion don't have enough, and we're dealing with climate change and cities that are as polluted as Delhi was today, that we should sit there and go, it has to just be solar, it has to just be wind. That's just unreasonable, and I don't think that's consistent with some of the fundamental values that we all share around the need for human flourishing and development and environmental protection.
Thank you for that. This, as you can see, this becomes very complicated for a policymaker who doesn't understand these things, because there are very sharp and trenchant arguments for different sorts of, sort of production functions, I would call it as an economist. And then you hear stuff like solar has rare earths, and where do you dispose solar panels? Then you have the huge issue of liability, which has been thrown at us. And we also have the fact that, many of us developing countries, all we have with us is coal. So I think a future where we let the science determine where we go, but use the precautionary principle another way, which is I'll use what I have and do what I have with what I've got, is the only solution until the world can perhaps offer us a more consensual deal faster and better. So on that somewhat somber note, I must conclude and invite you all to join dinner. Thank you to all the panelists for the very lively discussion, and thank you.